What is cultural suicide? That is a term I first came across in a 2005 academic study from Stephen Brookfield about how people in educational settings overcome a sense of impostorship, how they overcome emotional barriers, and particularly how they deal with the different language that is often present in academic and professional settings when that's not what you're used to at home. This video will cover things around cultural suicide in more depth, also the stakes of being ourselves in different environments and how learning the vocabulary and language of one context can alienate us from another, as well as things such as code switching and how to retain or maintain integrity and find acceptance and find accepting spaces. So, to go back to the term cultural suicide, it might sound extreme, but a basic example of what this means is when, say, you are from whatever background you're from, and you go to school or you go to a kind of university or something, and when you adopt certain ways of talking or ways of framing your experience, and then you go back home to an environment where that's not the way things are talked about or done, you get a sense of rejection or ostracism. And it kind of can work the other way as well, like if you have a really kind of fancy elocution lesson type experience at home and you speak in proper English or the proper, received pronunciation in whatever language it is that you speak. And then you go to an academic or professional setting and everything's a bit more like chilled and there's a different lingo or dialect, and you can feel alienated and isolated. I guess it goes into a little bit how privilege works and how that kind of can work in reverse or not, if you hold privilege. And ultimately everyone as an individual can suffer a sense of ostracism and alienation, whatever their conditions and whatever their privilege, because that's the nature of humans and trauma and relative suffering. Suffering is only like relative to our own experience, and definitely I've experienced this when, because of like my education, I've gone and learned how to speak in certain ways and like speak more clearly, and I still have like quite a strong accent, but certain things like the way I articulate myself or the sincerity I speak with or the way I articulate myself in general has often resulted in a bit of alienation, especially like, my mum has asked me before, like, why do you speak like that? Nobody speaks like that when I talk like I'm talking now, because there's just a kind of way of speaking in the part of the world where I'm from and in the class that I'm from, which is very much like casual and, you don't really, everything's just a bit light and airy. And a good example is how, at school, if you ever really showed any interest in anything, and maybe this is the same for school in general, because people have schooling experiences and teenagers are mean and everyone gets mocked and nobody is kind of protected from that, even if you're like in the cool crew. And really what this can result in and do is create this sense of like separation or duplicity, because it's like, well, who am I and where do I fit in? And I've experienced this kind of feeling a lot in a lot of the different contexts I've existed in. Obviously in school, I didn't feel like I really fit in or belonged, and then when I went off to higher education or further education, I felt like I didn't belong again. So because at school it was like I was using too many fancy words, and then at uni it was like I wasn't using enough fancy words and I had too much of an accent, and my accent would get pointed out as, like, oh, like, I love your accent, it's just always like people parroting you, and it's fine, it's like, it's funny, but I do understand that, and I do believe that there's a lot of sensitivities around it, particularly when there's like quite an established standard in terms of how people speak and appear in certain spaces, and that's in, let's say, the cultural milieu of England, because and Britain, actually, because I studied in Edinburgh, because that's what I know, that's my context as a white British / Irish working class / middle class individual from the kind of northern region of Yorkshire with an accent. How I've experienced it is really varying. In a lot of cultural theory and around discussions around like white privilege, there's this term code switching that comes up a lot, and that's another example of maybe when people have a particular lexicon or way of speaking, maybe there's a sort of a language that people speak with their community or with their family or with their kind of ethnic group even, and then that's not tolerated and it's not kind of allowed, and it might be a bit energetic or a bit sort of sassy or whatever for the space that you're in when you go into an academic or professional context, and it can result in people, you know, really having to like suppress a lot of themselves, and this obviously disproportionately affects people who have who are from a different ethnic background, or they might have a particular language or kind of casual dialect that they use, or even mannerisms. So, and the code switching refers to this tendency that people adopt to have to like minimise the way that they authentically, truly communicate and are in order to fit in to a kind of like rigid, like blah 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 blah, like Snoopy parent type vibe, if anyone's seen Snoopy Parent. If anyone knows what I mean by Snoopy parents. And really there are quite high stakes to like being yourself, and I don't believe that there is like one self, and we are many selves, and we can be different people in different contexts. And my mum's always made me laugh because she's always like spoke in different voices, like depending on who she's speaking to. On the phone, for example, it would be like, you know, there'd be this like adaptiveness to if she was speaking to family and she'd go into her Irish accent, or if she was speaking to like my friend's mum who was really middle class, it would be really formal and blah blah blah. And I'd always be like, well, you know, why do you change yourself? Why do you change your voice to fit in? And she was like, it's called leveling. It's what you do, you know, it's what you do to kind of bridge the gap between you and the person, and create like a common meeting ground in the middle and find a shared language between you. And I think it's like really complex figuring out this balance of what can be like how we maintain our integrity and authenticity, and how we adapt, because humans are mammals, so we are adaptive and we adapt to get connection and love, and that's okay, that's normal. There's a lot of pathologizing of being adaptive, and you know, people saying that like if you're adaptive then you're compromising yourself. But one of the people I really enjoy engaging with around this is Martha Beck, who wrote a book called The Way of Integrity. And Martha Beck speaks very compellingly about integrity and having integrity as being the opposite of duplicity. So integrity is being one thing, and duplicity is like splitting and being many things. And if we're in a situation and we have to like split parts of ourselves off or suppress parts of ourselves, and those parts of us kind of die inside, like it's not really very good, and then that ends up manifesting as, you know, stress or illness or resistance or those kinds of things, and parts of us remain dormant. And it reminds me a lot of the conversation around trauma, particularly Gabor Mate and all of those kinds of people like Peter Levine and Deb Dana, and Stephen Porges, I don't know what it is, but this is an example, right? Because I'll just pause a second. No, I'll finish my sentence. So what I was going to say about them is that they talk about the self, and I think there's other theories in psychology around like the divided self, R.D. Laing and things, about how the self has to like split. But this idea that the self is compromised, and our formation of our ego is like compromised and split by all of the ways that we have to adapt and abandon our authentic expression and our like baby level of like shaking and blah 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 blah. Whatever we do, we shrink ourselves in order to be accepted by what's around us, and we adapt our behaviour based on the feedback we get from the adults around us or the other children around us. And that's why, you know, you get this thing of like, if you're a bit weird and you have to like wind your neck in, and then that all kind of manifests in the body and you get stiff and resentful, and then you know, you find probably weird outlets for your expression, like me. But yeah, the thing I was going to say before I interrupted myself is how another way this is manifested for me is particularly in university, and like when you're in creative art settings and everyone's talking about like, and this is like the intellectual ones, not the inclusive, accepting, loving, diverse ones, you'll find that people like would talk a lot about spatiality and like reference artists, like, and I know there's so many contemporary artists, like there's millions, literally millions, and there's a very international world as well, so there's lots of names that are really hard to pronounce, just because like if you have one language, and I don't speak any other languages, I'm not saying that's because of my education. Well, it is because of my education, actually. I'm going to own that. It's because of my education and my laziness as an adult to not redress the shortcomings of my state school education, which did not adequately provide me with being taught a foreign language. And I could obviously, as an adult, take responsibility and do that now, but it's very hard, and so far the little bits of French that I've learned haven't been worth my time. But there is a lot to be said for how there's this kind of like, often in certain academic or critical contexts, there's this like snobbery, and if you get a word wrong or if you pronounce something wrong, there's a lot of shame, and it's a bit like and then this is on the opposite side is the cultural suicide of going away, getting an education, learning how to talk properly, and then going back to your hometown or going back to the pub or going back to your family and trying to sort of use that vocabulary in that setting and being like looked at like, who do you think you are? Like, who does this guy think he is? Which is exactly what I think. There's a sketch that my dad always references, which is, I think it might be Bill Hicks, and he's talking about how somebody's caught reading, and it's like, looks like we got ourselves a bit of a reader. And I had that at school. Like, I remember being on the bus and reading a book. I think I was just looking at my music book, actually, and someone got this is a really funny story, and Sean, I love you, and I love telling this story, so I don't have any bad blood about this at all. But this guy Sean, who was in my form group, saw me reading on the bus, and he didn't say anything at the time, and then the next day when I got to school, like people were just like calling me, I think it was Mormon first, but I think it was Amish first, because they'd watched a documentary at school. Everyone in the year had watched a documentary about the Amish in humanities, and the Amish, you know, famously don't have any technology, they don't have they don't have buttons, and so I think the way that this nickname came about is that I was seen reading, and because I was reading and because a book was like a lame old person historic thing to do, reading a book, I was nicknamed Amish, which then became Mormon. And it's just like a classic example of how, like, I mean, you'd expect being at school that reading would be normal, but not where I was from, and not at the school I went to. It was kind of like, if you read, you're a weirdo. Like, yeah, again, who do you think you are? Like, having an intellectual curiosity. So that's just a little bit about that. I've talked about integrity, and I think really what I want to end on is that we all have to adapt, and I want to reinforce that. But there are also, I'm finding, and I'm trying to create more loving, more inclusive spaces. I think this is also happening in education and higher education. It is happening slowly, and there's this kind of old guard of like elitism that is being eroded, and especially with so many of the conversations around privilege, and a lot of which has come from the US and the French continental philosophy thing. A lot of it's come in the form of like cultural theory, and that's kind of like had this domino effect, meeting with social justice movements, meeting with forms of activism, and it's kind of like cascaded into this anti-elitist stance where a lot of people are trying to create safe and inclusive spaces, although some of that vocabulary and some of the things that are advocated by those movements can also be quite elitist, because it's about, people's language, and there's a lot of terminology to get your head around, and ultimately and shaming if you get things wrong, which is also really bad. But I've been finding that there's a term from I think it was originally from Stendhal. Again, I'm looking for this like intellectual frame of referencing. I'm not 100% sure, but it was popularised by Carl Rogers, the humanist philosophy, sociology educator type person, psychology wonder kid, and it relates to the idea of, if I were talking about Heart School, unconditional love, but rather unconditional positive regard. And that is having spaces, circles, let's say. Carl Rogers was also an advocate of the circle as a format for, being in a community, creative space, academic space, circling around, being in that democratic sort of format rather. And where, having spaces where people can come as they are, and whatever their language is, whatever their mannerisms are, they can be accepted and included. And it also relates to the neurodiversity argument as well, that like, what is normal? Why do we have these weird things where we're just all like these repressed people sitting in seats and talking in this very intellectual, white, middle class, upper class, blah 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 way, when actually like everyone's got like loosey-goosey, weird little mannerisms and weird little shiny things. And I remember it like I went to no, I'm not going to tell that story actually, but I think creating, and this is the responsibility, I suppose, of people who are holding space and creating settings for others to interact and learn and come together. It's on us, it's on you, and it's on everyone to make those as unconditionally, positively regarding as possible. And really just, we've got to all feel like we can be ourselves to an extent, not in the way, not to an extreme of like violating anybody else, but a place where we can all be ourselves and be in our integrity and not receive too much bullying or rejection or ostracism from others, or shame for being a bit different. And it works both ways, whether it's from home, whether it's from the academic or professional world. I do feel like the world is becoming a kinder, more caring place, and obviously I'm not really speaking here to victim consciousness, and obviously people are all on their own journey and their own path, and everybody who does experience a bit of ostracism or judgment, that's all a lesson, and it builds resilience. But it's not to say that when it can be avoided, it shouldn't be avoided, because it should, I believe. and people can also, really like learn to navigate this for themselves in a way that is authentic to them. I would love to know in the comments below how you have experienced this, if you have experienced feeling of judgment or shame or alienation, isolation, ostracism from having your authentic expression in any context, whether that's your parents or your friends or peers, or whether it's a professional, academic, creative, cultural context in which you have felt you can't fully be yourself and you are shamed for being yourself. And other than that, if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, share with people, and check out more on Heart School's coaching services, community offerings on the links in the description. Much love.